The time compass.
Mesopotamia, Part 1.
If any one of us living today wanted to find out about our lives, we could start by looking back at our life stories.
Once upon a time, there was a very small boy.
And from there, we could learn about our lives. But to really know who we are, we need to know where we came from. So perhaps we should start with the stories of our parents.
Once upon a time, there were my parents.
This would provide a little more information about who our parents were and where they came from. But to really know the stories of our parents, we'd have to learn about our grandparents. But where were our grandparents born? They were small once too. So really the story should be about our great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents, or great-great-great-great-great-grandparents.
Once upon a time, at the beginning of history.
Okay, so let's really start at the beginning. About 9,000 years ago, people were just starting to emerge from living in caves. They began building homes. They learned how to plant crops, harvest food, raise livestock. And they formed the first towns and cities. So,
once upon a time, civilization was born.
The story begins in a place surrounded by two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. A wide, flat area in the shape of a large half-moon with fertile land, a comfortable climate, and lots of fresh water coming down from the mountains. This place was called Mesopotamia, which in Greek means the land between two rivers. Today, these two rivers can be found flowing through the countries of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and emptying into the Persian Gulf.
From nomads to settlers.
A group of nomads reached Mesopotamia around 6000 BC. And there they learned to plant seeds and harvest crops. Since they no longer needed to go out in search of food, they settled into houses, thus forming the first settlements in history.
But what will we eat, Mommy?
We'll grow our food, dear. Thanks to farming and raising livestock, these people stopped being nomads, which means people always moving in search of food. Instead, they stayed in one place all year round. This is called sedentism. The settled life benefited these peoples in other ways too. They began dividing up work and creating new and different goods. This is how the first trades began, such as builder, baker, shoemaker, and farmer, amongst many others. And there were also those who dedicated themselves to governing and protecting their people. In other words, soldiers and rulers. This new structure gave people more time to pray. And so they constructed the first temples, and the first priests came into being. News of the successful settlements in Mesopotamia was spread far and wide. And other people came from different regions to settle the land. The most important of these settlers were the Sumerians. Between the years 4000 and 2400 BC, the Sumerians built various cities, such as Uruk, Ur, Amma, Nippur, and Lagash. The Sumerians also invented the first form of writing. Because of this, today we consider the Sumerians to be the oldest civilization in the world.
The driving force of history.
Okay, now we have some fertile land, farming of crops and livestock, cities, a government, an army, and priests. Wow! So with all this, we can say we have a society here. So is that it? Is that all there is to having a society? No. There were lots of things still to discover. You see, now that the Sumerians had perfected the techniques of stock breeding and farming, it wasn't long before they were producing more food than they needed. With all that food, The people had time to work on other things, like creating other goods. But soon they had more than they needed of that. So what did they do with all they had that was left over? They began to sell it to other peoples in exchange for money or other products that they didn't have. This became the principle of trade. Also, the Sumerians were the first people to use the wheel for transportation. This helped them to reach very distant lands with heavy loads of merchandise. The traders needed to count everything that they bought and sold, which is how the first forms of math were developed. The Sumerians counted using the phalanges of the fingers. Let's see how. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's right. Each time one hand was completed, a finger on the other hand was raised. A Sumerian could count up to 60 with his hands. This form of counting was called the sexagesimal system. And even though thousands of years have passed, we still use it today. For instance, we divide the hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, and the year into 12 months. The Iron Age. The development of trade created a lot of wealth, and the accumulation of this wealth created a lot of power. But trade was not the only way to obtain wealth and power.
I'm not gonna trade for this money. I'm just gonna take it.
Invading a territory and taking the wealth of others is how the first wars developed. Over the course of centuries, those peoples that had the best armies were the ones that could possess the greatest wealth. Powerful armies could take by force all that was within their reach, especially gold, silver, and other precious metals. These invaders also captured the inhabitants of the settlements they invaded, forcing them to work as slaves. One such invader was a king called Sargon, who led the people of Akkad. Under the command of their ambitious king, the Akkadians came down from the mountains in the north of Mesopotamia, and by the year 2370 BC, managed to conquer all the Sumerian cities. And so it was that Sargon was the first king in history to create an empire.
I win! I'm the greatest!
But when the heirs of Sargon died, the empire fell, and the land was divided for many centuries. Until the Assyrians came along. They formed an incredibly powerful army around 1000 BC and managed to conquer and control the entire region. The Assyrians had amazing war chariots and an army of both infantry and cavalry. But their greatest advantage was when they learned to make weapons out of iron, which were stronger and harder than everyone else's bronze weapons. And this gave the Assyrians a huge advantage. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass and find out about the history of tools. Homo habilis, which means skillful man, appeared in Africa about 2 million years ago. This ancestor to humans was the first to make tools from sticks and stones. This was the beginning of the Stone Age. 1 million years later, Homo habilis had evolved into Homo erectus, which means upright man. Homo erectus made better tools, built simple shelters, and learned how to use fire. Just 15,000 years ago, bows and arrows were used for the first time, with points made of bone or stone. Then the first tools and weapons made of metal were made in Mesopotamia about 7,000 years ago. These were made from the soft metal called copper. About 5,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Mesopotamia discovered that if they melted copper in ovens and mixed it with another soft metal called tin, they could make a much stronger metal. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the beginning of the Bronze Age. But it doesn't end there, because there's another very strong metal called iron. This metal needs very high temperatures in order to make it into anything. And nobody at that time knew how to do this. Eventually, people figured out a technique to melt iron about 3,000 years ago. And with this discovery, stronger weapons and more efficient tools were made. The Iron Age had arrived. Coming up in the next episode, Mesopotamia Part 2.